So today we're interviewing Glena Clearwater on the guides and brownies of Nipigon. Go ahead, Glena.
Thank you. My background on the Girl Guides, for one thing, was living in London, Ontario, where I was born. I was a brownie, a Girl Guide, and a cadet. A cadet was sort of the late teens of Girl Guides, and they groomed you to be a leader. So that led to me being a Girl Guide leader at St. Matthew's Church. We had a little wooden hall at the back of the church that we met in. And then I was also a brownie tawny owl, which would be a helper. And we went out to the Munsee Indian Reserve outside of London. Even in those days, I got involved in a lot of hiking and camping. Hiking required a fair distance to get outside of town because we lived sort of in the corner of the city. And so when I arrived in Nipigon, the outdoors was right on my doorstep. And it was natural that I would then offer to help with guides. And that lasted at least over 30 years. Joan Anderchuk and Jean Aubert were the leaders then, and Marilyn Went was a junior leader. And I learned pretty quick from guide Diana Salonen that you never schedule anything on the same night that the Nipigon Flyers played hockey, because nobody would come. We met at the Elks Hall in those days. It was kind of neat because it had 2 or 3 different rooms that we could utilize. We had teas there, we had Christmas plays, Christmas bazaars. We often helped serve at functions. We raised money for everything from toys and treats for the children's ward in the Nipigon Hospital, which we don't even have anymore, but in those days there was a separate children's ward, and we often provided treats for seniors. I remember the one time Dot West came to town. She was a very famous, well-known cooking person. I never knew if she was really Dot West or if that was the name of the company. But she came and put on a show at the Elks Hall, and every Girl Guide showed up in their full uniform to learn about cooking. And I still remember liver, onions, and stewed tomatoes done in an electric frying pan. Electric frying pan was something new in those days, and I always remember that. In the early years of guiding, of course, brownies and guides were always interested in earning badges. And we used a lot of people in the community to pass the girls or to test the girls. It would be anything from cooking to first aid to... I'm trying to think of all things. I would think there may be 30 badges that girls could do, including a religion badge. But also the guides were expected to show up in full uniform, not white running shoes, but blue socks and black or brown shoes. And we spent a long time learning how to polish a Girl Guide pin. You used either a silver polish or in a pinch used toothpaste, and it worked quite well. The guides had a pin that was in the shape of the trefoil. The brownies had a little pin that was in the shape of a brownie. And both brownies and guides wore a tie, and one of the hardest things to learn was to tie the tie properly so that it was the right length, 3 fingers from the belt, and it had a big knot in it. And then you wore your pin in the middle of it. And I think that a lot of girls got very frustrated by having to learn to tie that. But the reason for that shape of tie was because in a pinch, it was a sling. If you broke your arm or if you sprained your arm, it worked perfect as a sling. And I still use a reef knot. Knots were also a big fun thing to do, and a reef knot is one of the handiest knots that I ever learned to do. The guides moved around. The brownies did as well, but I followed the guides more times. We went from the Elks to the St. Mary's Church, and in the back of St. Mary's Church property was a long wooden hall. And I remember it was not really warm in the wintertime, but it had sloping floors, and they were perfect for marble races because you could start at one end of the hall and the marble would roll down to the other end because there was such a slope on it. We went to the Catholic Church basement, we went to the United Church, we were upstairs in the Legion Hall, and to the gym at the Nipigon Public School, and even at Greenmantle School for a while. Now that I look back, I have no idea why we moved around so many times, but we did move a great deal. And people were very accommodating. to us that when they provided those spaces for us. Cubs and Scouts met mostly at the school and at the Legion. And I think Gary Cooper, who was an OPP here, was a very big part of the movement, as well as offering his services to teach first aid classes to guides, and he led us on many, many tours of the OPP station, something that the children today don't get the opportunity to do, and we got to see everything that the OPP were involved in, and they would often come to a meeting to explain some of the things they did. Leaders for the Brownies in some of those early years were people like Helia Skillen, Cookie Dampier, Lillian Silta, Noreen Bierman, Elizabeth Harding, and Margaret Wendt. Margaret and Marilyn Wendt were both part of the guide movement, as was Alvy, but Margaret went on to be both a Brownie and a guide leader. Guide leaders came and went with their daughters, and for years the most constant ones included people like Enid Dampier, Lita Godden, who only had nieces in the movement, Glenda Haskell, myself, and Edna Locker. And I think both Herman and Bill Locker were behind the scenes leaders in those days. Bill and Edna were the most amazing creative people in Nipigon, and nothing was a stumbling block when it came to decorating for a special event or for the fishing festival parade. And their basement was reportedly overflowing with props, costumes, and decorations for guides, Brownies, Cubs, Scouts, and even later on the Lions Club. On the closest Sunday to February 22nd every year, there would be a parade or a church service commemorating Thinking Day, which was the combined birthdays of both Lady and Lord Baden-Powell, who were the founders of the Scouts and later the Girl Guides. Lord Baden-Powell was involved in the Boer War and saw the activities that the men learned there, the outdoor skills, and he brought that back to England and started the Boy Scout movement. And when Lady Baden-Powell noticed that girls were trying to get into the Boy Scout movement, she decided that she would start up the Girl Scouts. So in England, it was still called the Girl Scouts. When it came to Canada, it was called the Girl Guides. And Thinking Day usually included special services. We collected money. I mean, can you imagine we collected pennies in those days? Penny wouldn't go very far today because there aren't any around. But we would make a big trefoil on the floor and fill it with pennies, and then all those pennies would be donated to the Girl Guide headquarters, and it went to help guides in other countries. The church services often included the girls or the boys taking part in the service, and at any time if there was a new flag purchased for a unit, it would be taken to the church to be dedicated. I can remember us taking our flags to the Lutheran church. We didn't buy flags very often, but I can remember the pastor at the Lutheran church dedicating the flag. There was a religion and life badge for both Scouts and for guides. And I would think that most of them were earned by the children who went to church regularly or attended Sunday school. It wasn't a badge that everybody tried to achieve. But we had local mothers with lots of skills, and including my mother when she moved to Nipigon from London, and where she had been a commissioner of Girl Guides, was often involved in testing, teaching. She was especially good at teaching the girls how to make doll clothes because that was her forte. As I mentioned, when I moved here, the outdoors was right at a doorstep. So hiking was a big priority in all seasons. And winters was mostly to the Bald Spot, where you could slide, you could cook, whatever, up on that big flat rock that is still a very popular place for people to go. On nice weather, it would be walking all through that bush out to Matta's Road. We were up on the mountain. I remember even when Edna Locker was with us, we actually climbed the mountain that overlooked Sunshine Valley, as Sharon Wick would call it, but you went in on the side of the mountain where the old ski hill was, where you just turned off to go to the golf course. You'd climb up there, and when you got to the top, you could look over, down over Sharon Wick's house and out towards Red Rock. It was an amazing climb, and I don't think I've ever done it again, but it was quite a hike. We went down the Nipigon River lots of times, down by Matchett's on the shores because the water was much lower then, so you could walk all along the edges. We went to the marina, and we went down the Nichols-Dampier Road across the river. And I just wanted to share a little story there. The girls often had to pass a test that required making a fire and cooking a meal. Well, Ethel Miller, was one of my guides, and she was very precise. That was her mother's teaching to Ethel. So when we went there, she had to make a meal for me. I was going to be the tester. Well, I get there. She's got a little bonfire going on the side of the river, and out she pulls is a kettle. She has the water there. She fills the kettle with water, boils the water, and I'm expecting, a cup of tea. Oh no, out comes the china teapot. Ethel puts the tea bags in the teapot, makes a cup of tea in the teapot, lets it steep, and then serves me a cup of tea. I've never forgotten that, and I shared that when I did Ethel's obituary at her funeral, because I thought her grandchildren would appreciate that story. She was so precise about things that she did. Smelt fishing was a very big thing that we did every spring, from Mazukama Bay to going out to Hercot and waiting for the train to go by, and then all the smelts would come through the culvert. And I can still remember Ray Lynn Stewart as one of the guides filling a black garbage bag with smelts, carrying it home over her shoulder for her dad. I never did hear if he really appreciated all of those smelts coming home or not, but it was a fun time, and we often ate smelts right out there. We also went to Fort William once on a blistering hot sunny day, had front row seats. I think we sat on the ground actually, and was for the Queen's visit. The Queen was on a cross Canada tour, and she stopped at Old Fort William, and the guides were part of the crowd that were invited to attend there. And another time someone important stopped was Lady Baden-Powell was on a tour across Canada on the CPR. She stopped in Nipigon, and Everett, of course, was handy with his camera and snapped a picture of Lady Baden-Powell standing on the side of the CPR lawn with a lot of guides, scouts, brownies, and I think Mrs. O'Neill was the guide leader then, and she is in the photo. So lots and lots of little things that were done in those days. But camping was also a big part of it, year-long. We were so fortunate that Polly Lake Girl Guide Camp, which was under the jurisdiction of Thunder Bay, which was Port Arthur, Fort William in those days, so fortunate that it was handy. We spent more time there than I think the girls from Thunder Bay did. We went summer and winter. We went in the fall, and often we would bicycle all the way out to Polly Lake and stay overnight and then come back again. When we camped out there, we were thrilled because in those days the beach was at least 50 feet wide, so it was games and bonfires and walking the whole length of Polly Lake to look at all the camps that were along there. We did lots of canoeing, lots of swimming. We were fortunate that a few times the lifeguards came from Nipigon out to the guide camp, and for a couple of years we had junior leaders that were actually lifeguards at the same time. And Polly Lake was a very popular spot for all kinds of guide companies from Thunder Bay, plus the guide comes from Nakina, Geraldton, Marathon would come there, and we often spent our time camping in Marathon with Olive Ross. And I remember that one little incident was early in the morning to hear a rattle and a bang, and it was the employees from Marathon coming to spray the whole campsite away for the bugs. And I'm often thinking, oh, is that really safe in there? We were ingesting all of that spray that they were putting on. But I guess it worked. I don't remember a lot of black flies in those days. But I did learn one thing, and that was to take an old hot water tank, turn it on its side, put a tap on the end, fill it with water, and put a fire underneath it, and you had hot water all day long. So we did that at Polly Lake. And Polly Lake had a contest one time for a badge, and you can see this poncho that I have on, which was made by Edna Locker, has all kinds of crests on it. And Eileen Dampier entered the contest for the one for Polly Lake, And somewhere on here, I have the winning badge. Eiley created this badge, and it was then reproduced for anybody to buy or be given that went to the guide camp at Polly Lake. And I don't even know, it may still be the one if they still have it. So camping was an experience that involved guides locally, brownies locally. I think Anita Lang and Cookie Dampier will relate the fact they even went to camp out there when they were young. So Polly Lake was around for a very long time. When you first came across the bridge into Polly Lake, there were 3 cabins up on the property there, and I can't remember the lady's name now who owned them, but after a while they were not used anymore, because at one time Polly Lake had a little store, it had a campground there, and they rented out canoes and boats, and that lady decided she would sell them. So working with Nipigon and with Thunder Bay, we were able to purchase those buildings, and through the generosity of movers, they were moved down into the Girl Guide camp. It took a few years to retrofit them. We put them all up there, and of course the Guide camp is now the Sea Cadet camp from Thunder Bay, and they're still using those same buildings. We were very fortunate to have those, because it improved the camping scene out there, because some of the tents over the years would not be sufficient, because as times change, girls did not really want to sleep on the ground or sleep on a hard floor. They preferred to have a camp bed. And inside those buildings, we were fortunate to be able to put the camp beds, because that site had been a bush camp, and Bill Hurd has all of the information on that, because he worked there. And it was a bush camp that also had the horses there. And he was one of those people who worked there. So the bunk beds from those bush camps went into the Girl Guide camp. So we were able to house a lot of girls in those days because of those bunk beds. I think that the season out there was really long for us. We were able to go there so easily, so quickly. If we wanted to hold just a special event, we could go out to Polly Lake and be right on the campsite there. I can remember Georgia Danaher from Thunder Bay. She lived here as well, but took the guides out there, and on May long weekend, there was so much snow that the OPP had to go out and rescue them, drive them into Nipigon, and they spent a couple of days in the Elks Hall. I just remember how unseasonable some of the camping scenes would have been out there. And I think that as I wind up this little part, there was a time when all of the girls would come into church as well. Volunteers from Nipigon would drive out, especially for the Catholic children, bring them into Mass on a Sunday morning. The other girls would hold a service at the campsite, and it was called Guide Zone. And that was part of our singing for campfires and for Guide Zone. I just wanted to add a little bit more to some of the guiding and information. Along with the scouts and the guides, brownies, cubs here in Nipigon involved a lot of volunteers. And the scouts ended up, again with the bush camp, at Pine Portage. Again, it was donated from Abitibi to them. It had a great big hall, a magnificent big hall, plus a couple of smaller buildings. And the scouts would only use it a couple of times a year. So being that Bill Locker was involved with the scouts, and then Edna was involved with the guides, it ended up that the girls were asked to use the campsite instead of just going to Polly Lake. So I can remember going out there and Bill going around and explaining a whole lot of things about hydro out there, and then us being involved in the canoeing out there. The canoeing was amazing, because that site on Lake Nipigon was where it was flooded after they put the dams in. So when you canoed out over the edge of the lake there, you would see all the logs, all the stumps of the trees under the water, where they had cut all the trees off before they flooded that property. It was an amazing sight to be able to just glide over there in a canoe and see that. We had a lot of fun swimming in among those logs in some of the places. There was a couple of places that were better swimming than others. And I think that out there we did a test that had to be overnight camping. A guide had to go into the bush. She had to create a little site that was safe for sleeping in. It could be trees, it could be branches, but it couldn't be a tent. And she had to spend the night in there with one other friend. And I mean, we were right like with a stone's throw from the building, but for lots of girls that was quite traumatic to have to be out there in the bush by yourself overnight. And we had lots of good experiences there. Edna Locker was always the cook, great cook. I have memories and pictures of Kelly and Bert and Edna making pizza to serve to everybody, because Edna had 3 girls in guides. Kelly was in scouts. I had Alice in guides, but I had the boys. So often Alan and Bert and Kelly came along on those trips with us, and enjoyed everything just as much as the girls did. And I think that Pine Portage was a different type of camping to Polly Lake, because it was a little bit more remote and it had a lot of history with it. Herman ended up building an outhouse for that camp area, and it was one of the last buildings to be there when that was burnt down. The M&R a few years ago were taxed with burning the campsite, the camps down, because they had become derelict. And I remember Ted telling us that Herman's camp building, Biffy, we called them Biffy's outhouses, was still there. Herman actually built outhouses for Polly Lake as well, and they were very well built and lasted a long time. One of the other things that would be frowned upon at Polly Lake in those days, we had huge burning barrels, and we burnt everything that we could in those burning barrels. And can you imagine, that would be, we would have a rotation of tasks for girls to do, from sweeping the floors, cleaning the outhouses, to burning the trash. And they would be responsible to be around all day picking up anything they could that we're not going to use and burning it in that barrel. Oh my, we were not very kind to the environment in those days. But it was just an accepted practice in those days. And I guess we thought we were being very environmentally conscious by getting rid of a lot of litter and a lot of things that we would do in there. The hall at the Polly Lake camp was also a large building with great big tables in it and a nice big kitchen. The men from Nipigon would make sure that the propane tanks, those great big bottles, would be brought into Nipigon and taken back out again, because we didn't have small. Well, you go through too much if you had a small bottle there. But I can remember the fun of just sitting, the fellowship of loads of girls sitting around those tables. And you'd have a special meal when you couldn't use any utensils, or you had to use just a knife to eat your meal with, or, different things like that. Elbows off the table when you sang grace in there. So those kinds of memories I have lots of. I hope that the girls who were part of my guide company have some of those memories still. But I think that the biggest adventure that we went on was the year that Red Rock Mill went on strike. Herman was not very happy that I was going to go off to Duluth with the guides when money was a little bit short in those days, but with Lita Godden driving, and unfortunately I forget Maria Gentile's sister's name. She lives in Scriber, I think. She was a driver, and I was a driver, and we drove those girls down to Duluth. We stopped along the way and visited every site we could. In Duluth, we were put up in the YMCA and slept on the floors. And I remember that YMCA being on a hill, and the parking was atrocious in Duluth. And I can remember us finding a place to park. And going up and down the hills. I think that must have been maybe my first trip to Duluth, but it was interesting experience because I had not experienced hills quite that steep. But we were welcomed there by another guide company. We spent an evening with them, and they had a special program for us. I'm sure we were the first Canadian girls to show up there, and it wasn't until much later that I found out I was supposed to get special permission from Toronto to take the girls to the city in the States. I didn't do it. We just made our plans and we went there. We visited the zoo, we visited the train museum, we went on the boats, we shopped. And I can remember us going out early for breakfast one morning, and the poor waitress was so flustered because she was the only one working. So, of course, Lita jumped right in. She helped do the cooking and the serving, and the girl was very much appreciative. I'm sure we got 10% off on our bill that time because we helped with the meal. But I could also remember that Jaws had just come out. So that would give people an idea of the year, because Jaws was a movie, and I can remember us going to that movie, and Edna Locker sat with her hands over her face most of the time, peeking at it through her fingers. And I remember some of the parents weren't very happy when they learned we'd been to Jaws. You can imagine Jaws was supposed to be a deadly movie to take your girls to. Today it would be absolutely nothing. Scouts always sold apples, guides always sold cookies. And when I was young, the cookies were a single shortbread cookie in the very shape of a trefoil. And they would be sold in little boxes. Now they've evolved into chocolate and vanilla, and they've got icing in between, and they're in fancy boxes, and they likely cost about 3 times as much as they did in those days. But Nipigon Girl Guides sold a lot of cookies. We spent a lot of time selling them, taking orders. Sometimes you did better if you didn't take orders, but we sold them in the stores and went door to door. And that was the days when you could go door to door. Today you wouldn't really be allowed to go door to door as much. Margaret Went was one of the busy people looking after the sale of cookies too in those days. And we often ended up with boxes and boxes of them left over, and we're still selling them much later on. I just brought along a couple of things that I have kept. Most of the items behind us in this display case were from the guiding area. There are several things that are not included there. One of them is a large sheet of paper that was done in calligraphy by someone, and I think it might have been Bev Klein, of all the guides who ever were one of the members while I was a leader. So it's likely put away with some of the other things because there was so much going on. And actually I see this flag says Pathfinder on it, and I forgot that guides also had Pathfinders as well. But I do have a belt. This is an original belt that I had when I was a Girl Guide back in the 50s. It's got the trefoil on it, and it's a very neat belt with a clip on it, and it actually says John Leckie Company registered. And I wore that for a long time, and you can see that it's getting better days. But I liked it because it had the hooks on the side, so you could put your guide whistle on there, and on the other side I could hang a knife. And I think this is getting a little bit rusty now, but my mom and dad gave me this one because it was multi-use knife there. And the hats changed over the years, and this would have been the type of hat that would have been worn at the end. It was not a very pleasant looking when you got it on. It was. I like the old kind, the old hats. I don't know if there's one up there or not. Oh, that's the same up there. The old one was more like this type of hat up there. And at the guide camp, we did lots of crafts. We had the camp hats. I've got one there. And we would make things to put on the hat so that you knew each year you went to camp. And I can remember this octopus being one of the crafts that girls had to learn to braid. I wonder how many girls could braid today. This one's old and he's lost one eye. I also found that you were given a warranty card to be a leader. You just didn't get to be a leader. You had to take a test and you had to apply and be warranted. And this one actually is when I was in London. It's from the 31st London camp. And this one is when I first came to Nipigon, and it's the first Nipigon Guide Company. Of course, it's the first one because Nipigon never had too many Girl Guide camp companies. But it's interesting to keep those old things. And I'm sure somebody gave me this for a gift when I was leaving a brownie pack. It's, of course, dilapidated as well, but something that likely isn't available today. So I have very fond memories of Girl Guides in Nipigon and in London. It was part of my life, and in later years I was honored by being made a life member of Girl Guides. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Glena, for your time and sharing all your experiences with us.